Welcome everybody to the combination of Tredyffrin Public Library and Tredyffrin Easttown Historical Society program on Philadelphia's generals Hancock and Meade during the Civil War. This is presented by Arch Hunter. Arch has his master's in education from Eastern University, and he recently retired from a 25-year teaching career at the Marple Newtown High School. Arch is also the director of graduate programs at the Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge, a host on WFYL AM 1180, Our American Heritage Radio program, and he also serves on the board of directors of the Paoli Battlefield Preservation Fund. He's married to his wife of 29 years, that's quite an accomplishment, Melissa, and the father of 24-year-old twin sons. He's a big sports fan, likes the Eagles, Phillies, and Sixers, and also is an avid golfer. So welcome, Arch.
Thank you.
Before I hand it off to Arch, I do want to mention that the Tredyffrin Easttown Historical Society is wholly member supported. We invite you to go to our website at tehistory.org and please consider joining us or making a donation so we can continue to make these programs possible. Thanks so much, everybody, for attending, and welcome, Arch. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I certainly appreciate the opportunity. And I need to first thank Bart Van Valkenburg for putting this PowerPoint together. I am not a PowerPoint person, and Bart has put this together for me, so I certainly appreciate that. I met Bart, I guess about 2.5 years ago, when I was thinking about retiring and looking for some things to continue to be involved in. And I took Bart's car tour of the Paoli Battlefield area. And that's when I first met Bart and immediately was captivated by his passion and love for American history and certainly his military service to the United States. And I am proud to call Bart a friend, and when I see Bart, he calls me his buddy, which I greatly love that and appreciate that. And so Bart, thank you so much for putting this PowerPoint together and being the point person for coming and asking me if I would participate with you all again this year. So just a couple of corrections, which are very, very minor. I have now been married 31 years. And our sons are now 26 years old. So for my wife to have stayed with me 31 minutes, let alone that 31 years, is a great testament to her lovely personality and her perseverance with me. So let's continue. Let's get started on that. You know, Philadelphia played a vital role in the Civil War. Most people think, when they think of Philadelphia, they think of the Revolution. And I'd like to make the argument that I personally believe that Philadelphia had a bigger role and a more substantial role, even in the Civil War, than it did during the Revolution. And that's not to minimize Philadelphia and the Revolution. But Philadelphia, there was a federal government source for many medical supplies, money, weapons, medical care, hospitals, troops. About 17,000 infantry and cavalry troops came from Philadelphia during the Civil War. And two of the largest medical hospitals were here in Philadelphia. And about 95% of all the Union uniforms were made in Philadelphia for the Civil War. Philly also has 12 Union generals and 1 Confederate general. And twice, with returning veterans coming home from the Civil War, Philadelphia had returning Civil War parades, and both times, two of our favorite generals from Philadelphia, General Hancock and General Meade, were the grand marshals for that parade. So Philly had a tremendous influence during the Civil War. And we wanted to look at General Winfield Scott Hancock briefly and General George Meade briefly. Folks, I spend the majority of my time, I'm a military historian, so I study battles. So I'm going to try to stay out of the weeds, and Mary Ann, if I get into the weeds, do something, because this is not a talk on particularly specific military battles, but overviews of Hancock and Meade's participation and what they did to help the North win the Civil War. One small story: several years ago, I had a student, and his father is a Union Civil War reenactor, and their last name is Hancock. Well, when their son was born, the father wanted to name him Winfield Scott Hancock. Well, the problem was that he married a woman from Virginia. And so there was much discussion about naming their son Winfield Scott Hancock. So they compromised and they named their son Scott Winfield Hancock. So, you know, those things happen. So let's look at a little bit of General Winfield Scott Hancock. Born in Montgomery County, in Montgomery Square, which now we know as Montgomeryville. Winfield Scott has an identical twin, and his name was Hilary Baker Hancock. And then soon, at a young age, they moved to Norristown, and he spent the rest of his life living in Norristown. So he is one of our local heroes of the Civil War. And he's even buried in East Norriton. So Winfield Scott Hancock, not one of the more known generals of the Civil War, but certainly he had tremendous influence. And we're going to see in a few minutes. Winfield Scott also went to public school in Norristown, which today we call Norristown High School. So he has that very, very unique special flavor to his education. Before the Mexican War, Winfield Scott Hancock goes to West Point. He graduates 18th out of a class of 25. And all through, particularly the Civil War, the Union generals and many of the Confederate generals and many of the women from both sides of the Civil War said that General Hancock was the best looking man in the whole army. And so there were several different names. So even sometimes it's recorded that even the Southern women wanted to see General Hancock, even though he was a Union general. So those things are interesting to understand that humanity doesn't change. Many of these men served together during the Mexican War from both sides. A lot of these men graduated from West Point. They served together, both Confederate and Union generals during the war. And so we see a lot of them interacting during the Mexican War, and particularly what happened during the Mexican War. And you can see there that what Hancock did during the Mexican War. And he is wounded. First time he was ever wounded, he's wounded at the knee. And then later on, because of his service during the Mexican War, he is brevetted to first lieutenant, and then virtually he becomes a general. The Army officers in the Mexican War called him Hancock the Superb. He was a phenomenal general. He was a fighting general, and he had this aura about him that he really had command of his troops, and he really commanded men. And we're going to see that, particularly if I briefly touch on the Battle of Gettysburg when we get there. Oftentimes, many of the Union generals also called General Hancock the Thunderbolt of the Army of the Potomac. And it would be very similar to generals like General John Pershing in World War I, probably General Patton in World War II, and even General MacArthur. So the Thunderbolt, which means when Hancock was in battle, when Hancock showed up, just like a lightning strike gets all of our attention, Hancock was able to get the attention of the men during the battle. during the different battles that he participated in. Shelby Foote, who was a Southern historian. This is his quote from Shelby Foote about General Hancock. No other Union general at Gettysburg dominated men more by their sheer force than General Hancock. So this is a phenomenal general, and his command of his troops in the midst of battles was just a powerful thing to see. Before the Civil War, which you who have seen the movie Gettysburg, you'll remember that before the Civil War, General Hancock became very good friends with General Lewis Armistead from Virginia. And they continued to write back and forth to each other during the war. And then at Gettysburg, both Hancock and Armistead are wounded. Armistead is wounded mortally and dies within a couple of hours. Hancock is wounded there, but they were really hoping they could see each other again after the war, but Armistead is killed at Gettysburg. So let me move on here to, and where is my mouse? There's my mouse. Let's go. Here are the battles that Hancock had major significance in: Williamsburg, Antietam. And if you study maps and you look at maps and you look at Antietam, Hancock is strategically placed out on that battlefield, pay very close to where the commanding generals are, because there's major reasons why generals are in certain locations during different battles. And if you remember Antietam, that is the most bloodiest single day in American history. It 23,400 and I believe 78 men are killed within 6 hours at Antietam. Hancock is there. Pay attention to where he is placed on the battlefield of Antietam. That would show you how important Hancock's leadership was at Antietam. After Antietam and after the Peninsula Campaign, or Peninsula and Antietam, General McClellan, again, we know that he was no fan of President Lincoln. He telegraphed President Lincoln, and he said that General Hancock was the most superb general that he saw at Antietam. So again, he's beginning to build his reputation as a line commander at this point, and people are getting very aware of General Hancock and his abilities to command on the field. He's wounded at Fredericksburg, and then he's again wounded at Chancellorsville. And if you remember Fredericksburg, over 13,000 Union soldiers either are killed or are wounded at Fredericksburg after the debacle of General Burnside's with 14 frontal assaults up on the Marie's Heights, on General Lee's troops up there. So he is wounded twice again at Fredericksburg, and then again he is wounded again at Chancellorsville. Gettysburg, which that is where we begin to see, let me go back. Gettysburg, this is where we're going to begin to see Hancock's superior leadership on the field. Early on July 1st, after General Reynolds is shot and killed, General Meade is probably 8 miles behind the lines. General Meade sends up General Hancock. And he sends up Hancock to lead 1, 2, 4, and the 11th Corps. Now, he is outranked by many other generals on the field, but by this time, Meade has already seen how important Hancock's leadership is, and so he sends Hancock up to be the commander on the field. And in spite of General Howard's yelling and screaming and carrying on, it is Reynolds on the field that is given command of the troops until General Meade comes up there many, many hours later. This, folks, shows us One, it shows us Hancock's ability to lead. Two, it shows us Meade's confidence to put Hancock in charge of that many corps, in spite of being outranked and not being a superior general at Gettysburg. If you're familiar with Gettysburg, and I hope you all are, if you remember up on Oak Hill, when the Union line is being flanked and they begin to run for their lives, and they're running through the town of Gettysburg, and they're running for their lives to get away from the assault of the Confederate troops coming at them. And up on Cemetery Hill, it is General Hancock who stopped the retreat. And he reforms the lines up on Cemetery Hill. And generals still don't know how Hancock was able to do that. But he stops the Union retreat, reforms the Union lines up on Cemetery Hill, and we know that how significant the high ground is at all these battles. And it's Hancock who really saves the afternoon on that first day at Gettysburg by stopping these men who are running for their lives away from Oak Hill through the town, and he reforms the line up on Cemetery Hill. And it's still, and the Union troops hold the high ground for the next 3 days, or the next 2 days at Gettysburg. On the third day at Gettysburg, General Hancock is close to what we call Pickett's Charge over on Cemetery Hill. And on the third day, Hancock is wounded for the third time as he's watching the Confederate troops come across what we call Pickett's Charge and the Emmitsburg Road. Hancock is wounded. The mini ball hits the pommel of his saddle and it goes into his hip. And so pieces of wood, splinters, go into Hancock's hip. One of the metal nails that are holding his saddle together is ripped off the saddle, and it also embedded itself into Hancock's hip. Hancock looks in his right thigh, and he literally pulls that nail out of his right thigh himself, and he says that, boy, the Confederates must be hard up for your ammunition if this is what they're firing at us. And he had no idea at that time that that was really part of his saddle. The mini ball that went into his hip, he has 2 operations to try to remove that mini ball, and the surgeons cannot do it. So that mini ball stays in his hip for the rest of his life. After Gettysburg, he goes back to Norristown to recuperate from his wounds, and then he comes back to join the Army of the Potomac, and we see him at the Wilderness, which we see as a major battle. Spotsylvania, he is in the middle of the line of Grant's assault onto Lee's lines at Spotsylvania, and that was a horrible, horrible battle where it was 21 hours of hand-to-hand combat. Hancock then is at Cold Harbor with General Grant. And if you've never been to Cold Harbor, please go to Cold Harbor, and you can see the open field. You can see the entrenchments that General Lee had his Confederate troops behind. And most of the Union soldiers the night before Cold Harbor knew that they were probably going to die. They took pieces of paper or leather, they wrote their names and their where they were from, and pinned them or put them somewhere in their uniform. The next morning at Cold Harbor, General Grant has 7,000 men killed, not wounded, killed in 20 minutes at Cold Harbor. 7,000 men killed in 20 minutes at Cold Harbor. So again, we see General Hancock at Cold Harbor, and then he is then part of the siege at Gettysburg, or excuse me, the siege of Petersburg. So he is with Grant during the 40-day Wilderness Campaign, which is the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, the siege of Gettysburg or Petersburg, and North Anna. And it's not long after, during the siege of Petersburg, that General Hancock realizes that physically he's not able to carry on. So he gives, the last few months of the war, he gives up his command, and he gives up his command because he's physically, because of that mini ball, is not able to carry on physically any longer. And his second corps that he was the commander of, his second corps in 1 year had 40,000 casualties. So we see this, we see these tremendous numbers. Later on, after the war, General or President Johnson, who ordered Mary Surratt to be hung, General Hancock pleads for her life to President Johnson. President Johnson is going to have nothing to do with it. And President Johnson told General Hancock he must carry out the order to hang Mary Surratt. And what's significant is that Mary Surratt is the first female to ever be hung for conspiracy or treason. And it's General Hancock who was ordered by President Johnson to overlook or oversee the carrying out of her hanging. So General Hancock has that unfortunate situation that he must oversee. Later on, during 1880, Winfield Scott Hancock was a presidential nominee for the Democrats. General Hancock was a Democrat, and he receives many votes during the Democratic Convention in 1876. He gets the nomination in 1880, and he campaigns against James A. Garfield, and we know that Garfield wins the election. So he not only was a brilliant combat general, but he had the respect to oversee the hanging of the treasons against President Lincoln. He is well known enough to be the Democratic nominee in 1880. He had many of the similar beliefs of General McClellan that made him a Democrat. And then in 1870, and before this in 1872, when General George Meade died, General Hancock was now the most senior major general in the Union Army. So we see this going on. And the only northern state, now personally I would think that Hancock might have a very good time in Pennsylvania, winning Pennsylvania in 1880, but the only state that he won during the 1880 presidential election was New Jersey. So another shout out to New Jersey for giving their votes to General Hancock. Excuse me. In 1881, Winfield Scott Hancock is elected president of the National Rifle Association. And I'm going to read you a quote because I have many of my friends who are members of the NRA. I am not a member of the NRA. I do not own a gun, but I think it's interesting because so many of my friends continue to tell this to me about the NRA. So let me give you a quote from General Hancock when he was elected president. The object of the NRA is to increase the military strength of the country by making skill in the use of arms as prevalent as it was in the days of the Revolution. So as president of the NRA, which he was elected to in 1881, this is what he believed that should be the motive or the method for the NRA. The last public appearance that we see of General Hancock is he presided over the funeral of President Ulysses S. Grant. And when when General Hancock comes out to lead the funeral procession of General Grant, the historians say that we began to hear this applause for General Hancock, and he quiets the crowd down, and he makes some motions that, please, this is for General Grant, this is not for me. And so he directed silence and attention to General Grant. So he oversees General Grant's burial procedure, and that's the last public appearance that we see of General Hancock. He is buried in East Norriton at the Montgomery Cemetery, and you can see the picture of him there, his grave there, and you can go and visit that grave in East Norriton. There is a General Hancock Society that is very active, and you can get their information on the website. General Hancock dies in 1886, and he is affected with carbuncle and diabetes, and he dies in Governor's Island up in New York. And he was still in command of the military division of the Atlantic, and he's up at Governor's Island, New York. And again, he's brought back down, and he's buried in East or West Norriton. He outlived both of his children, and a couple of years later, General Hancock's wife, Allie, she wrote a book called The Reminiscences of Winfield Scott. She wrote that in 1887. So it's a tragedy. We see so many of these people at young ages dying and outliving their children, but he did that. Winfield Scott Hancock had a very, very good reputation in his personality as being honest and truthful, a gentleman. And in 1893, a Republican representative named General Walker. This is what I'll end with Hancock. This is what his characteristic of General Hancock was, and I keep thinking, boy, we certainly need that today in our American politics. So let me give you this quote that General Walker gave about General Hancock. Hancock had the chivalry, the stately personality, and the splendid gentleman behavior that was needed to be in the White House. And boy, that sure rings home true today. So in 1886, the $2,000 Treasury bill has a portrait of General Winfield Scott Hancock on it. And so we begin to see this idea of how important General Hancock was. And again, let me encourage you, look at the maps, pay attention to where these generals are on the field, and you will see how important they are during these battles. So Winfield Scott plays a significant role in the Civil War and the different battles that he participated in. And particularly we see at Gettysburg when he stops the retreat by himself, being the thunderbolt of the Union Army. He stops the retreat up on Cemetery Hill, and we know how important that was for the Union's Army's first victory over General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. So that's a very broad overview, but that should hopefully give you a little taste of a little bit of General Hancock and who he was and the significance and importance of General Hancock. So Marianne, I'll stop there and see if there's any questions so far.
Thanks so much. If you have a question, okay, I'll unmute you, I think. Yep, go ahead, Heidi.
Yes, I do have a question. What was the percentage that you mentioned, Arch, of uniforms that were made in Philadelphia for the Civil War?
Heidi, I've seen anywhere between 90 and 95%.
Okay. I asked because we're researching a soldier in 1861 whose formal picture is in a gray suit.
Oh.
So, thank you.
Well, again, is it really gray for one thing? I mean,
it's pretty gray.
It's pretty gray, huh? So,
and The reason I ask is because he was part of brigade in Virginia at Falls Bluff.
Huh.
And the soldiers were uniformed in gray suits, which had been confiscated in New York
Mm-hmm.
before they were shipped to the Confederate artillery. Isn't that funny?
Yes. Yeah. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Heidi. Okay. Mike, you have a question?
I do.
Oops. Unmute your,
How's that?
there you go. Okay.
Thank you. I worked for digital equipment in the 70s, and we used to take customers up to the old mill in Maine, Massachusetts. In the summertime, the floors, it was 5-story old mill, the floors would seep blue dye from the Union uniforms they made in the mill before digital took it over.
Wow.
But the second thing is, on one of the photographs of Hancock, he had his right hand stuck in his blouse. That's a Napoleonic pose.
Yes.
Is that how you, I mean, that's the second time I've seen it after Napoleon. Do all generals do that when they get their photographs taken?
A lot of the generals did do that. You'll also notice that General McClellan also did that. And there were several generals who would do that. And again, it was all what their personality was and what they liked. And again, it's a semblance back to Napoleon. And Napoleon thought that it would not only make him look tough, that it would make him look taller. So that's two reasons that Napoleon did it. And then several of the Union generals did that simply as either as respect for Napoleon, or they thought they wanted to show also how strong and tough they were with this Napoleonic, hand inside their jacket.
Okay, well, thank you.
And you also notice that, again, even through this time period, today, the photographer always tells us, smile. In that time period, they always told them to look very stern. And so you also notice that in the photographs, that so many of them look very stern and they almost look like they're angry, but they wanted to portray that.
Any other questions? Raise your hand in the. Okay. Not seeing any other questions.
Yeah, I just had one quick one I just thought of. Hancock didn't look overweight with diabetes. Did he have the juvenile stuff or the old age diabetes?
Please don't hold me. I believe it was old age, not the juvenile.
Even though he wasn't overweight.
Right.
Okay.
So,
all right. Thank you.
And it's a side point, but the women of that time period, they continued to mention, even in his old age, which was in his mid-50s, he was still a very good-looking man. Well, good for him, right?
Okay. Anyone else? Raise your hand. All right. On to General Meade.
General Meade. Usually, when I talk about some of the Civil War generals, I talk about General Meade and General McClellan, one being a phenomenal general, and the other one ended up being quite an embarrassment. And I just have to say that as we look at Meade and Hancock, we also have to remember that Philadelphia is also the home of General McClellan. So, that's a whole nother story. So General Meade is pretty much the other side of General McClellan. And most historians have agreed over the years that George McClellan is considered to be one of the 3 worst generals in American history. So if we're going Philly people, and I was born and raised in this area, if we're going to claim Meade, if we're going to claim Hancock, we also have to claim McClellan. So he's there. Meade is born in Cortez, Spain. His father, he comes from a very wealthy family. His father was a merchant, and he was serving as a naval agent for the United States government. And so Meade is born in Spain, and then quit. And not long, the family moves because of the death in his family. They moved to Philadelphia. So Meade is very young when they moved to Philadelphia. So we're going to claim him, even though he wasn't born here. We Philly people are going to claim George Meade. So this is where we begin to see Meade as a young man. This is a man who was extremely intelligent. Meade has a brilliant IQ. He is an engineering general. He does, what you'll see in a couple of minutes, so many of the things that he did before the war in engineering. So when he graduates from he goes to West Point at age 16. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but at age 16, I wasn't even allowed to drive a car at age 16. But Meade is able to go to West Point at age 16. He graduates 19th out of his class in a class of 56 cadets. And as I said, Meade becomes an engineer. So Meade has a very technical personality. And he's got a very technical thinking background, which is going to help him tremendously, particularly when he's elevated in command. So born in Spain, raised in Philadelphia, goes to West Point at age 16, and he becomes a civil engineer. He marries Margarita Sargent, which probably doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people, but her father was the running mate of Henry Clay in 1832. So he has significance also in that area. As again, which I just find this fascinating about Meade, that he was particularly involved as an engineer in building and designing lighthouses. So if you go to Barnegat Lighthouse on LBI, that's Meade. Absecon Lighthouse in Atlantic City, that's Meade. The Cape May Lighthouse, General Meade. If you go to Florida, the Jupiter Lighthouse in Jupiter, Florida, that's also designed by General Meade. And then also there's a Sombrero Key, in the Sombrero Key, the lighthouse down in the Florida Keys is also, that was designed by General Meade. Well, then he wasn't a general, but so this man is an engineer by trade. He is he's a private civilian, and he's comes up with these different lighthouses. He designs them. He also designs a hydraulic lamp that was adopted for the lighthouses so that the light could be shown out much farther, and the seamen could see it out there. So again, this engineering mind plays significance for General Meade and the Union Army later on in the war. Governor Andrew Curtin appoints General Meade to be a brigadier general of the Pennsylvania Volunteers in August of 1861. So he now is a part of the Army of the Potomac, and there you see the different battles that Meade is actively involved in as a line commander. He is wounded 3 times during the 7 days battles, which was part of the Peninsula Campaign. And if you remember, that's where General McClellan finally leaves Washington, D.C. with this massively large army of at least 115,000 men. He goes down and disembarks at Harrison Landing down in Virginia, and he announces he is going to take Richmond, and he's going to win the war. And so this is the Peninsula Campaign, and then during the 7 days battle, this is where, after the 7 days battle, is where McClellan begins to retreat away from Richmond. And also during the 7 days battle, this is where General Johnston, the Confederate general, is wounded, and Robert E. Lee is elevated to command the Army of Northern Virginia. And so Meade is wounded 3 times in the arm, his leg, and in the back, but he continues on. Second Bull Run, South Mountain. Again, we see him at Antietam. And again, look at the map and see where Meade is on the field. And this, again, this will tell you the importance of General Meade and what he's able to do. After Antietam, after Battle of Antietam, when McClellan is finally relieved of command, General Hooker is still not elevated to command, but General Hooker at Antietam says to General McClellan, look at Meade, look at Meade, look at Meade with his troops. More generals like that and more men being led by men like General Meade, I could win anything. And so already General Joe Hooker, who was called Fighting Joe Hooker, sees General Meade and he sees what he can do in battle, and he gives him a great compliment of this. So that is Antietam. And again, we see him at Fredericksburg, and again at Chancellorsville, and then we finally get to, now this is what's extremely important. Why don't many people know a lot about George Meade? His personality. He was quiet in his personality. He had a very short temper. He didn't like to be asked a lot of questions from the press corps. Again, he sounds like someone that I know that in modern day. He doesn't like the press. He believes that the press writes lies. The press corps does not like General Meade because of his temper, and they don't write very nice things about General Meade, but it's a personality that he has. And so Meade rarely wanted to talk to the press, and he doesn't like the press corps. So oftentimes when the press was writing about different battles, Meade is one of the generals that they don't write much about, sometimes because of his personality, sometimes because they didn't particularly like him. And Meade really particularly didn't want to have a lot of publicity. If we can correlate Meade to any general, particularly from World War II, he would be very similar to Omar Bradley, except Bradley did not have the quick temper of General Meade. Bradley didn't want to have publicity. He particularly didn't like to talk to the press corps, and so he was pretty much a quiet general. I find it very interesting that General Eisenhower said in many of his writings that Omar Bradley was the most important general that we had in World War II. And General Eisenhower said Bradley's problem was that he didn't ever seek publicity. So he didn't get credit for so many things. And if you remember, Bradley is our last 5-star general, and he's not elevated to the 5th star until 1950. And a lot of it was due because he didn't like the limelight. Very similar to Meade, except the press, he had difficulty with the press because of his temper. If you look at a map of Fredericksburg, and again, I've already mentioned how much of a disaster that was under the command of Ambrose Burnside. Meade is on the left flank, and Meade's division, Meade's corps, is the only Union corps at Fredericksburg to break through the Confederate line. No one else broke through the Confederate line. It's Meade's division who breaks through the Confederate line on the left flank, and the person's corps that he broke through was Stonewall Jackson's. So this shows you, it should show you Meade as a leader, but he's still not elevated in command. After Fredericksburg, when Ambrose Burnside is demoted back to a line commander, it is General Joe Hooker who is elevated to command the Army of the Potomac. And at Chancellorsville, Hooker headquarters is hit with a cannonball. A major beam in the ceiling comes down and hits Hooker in the head. It knocks him out. And when they wake him up, today we know he has a major concussion because he's speaking English, but people really don't understand. And if you've ever had a concussion, you pretty much think you're normal when you're not. And so Hooker is not normal. He has his troops retreat away from Chancellorsville. And this is where, after Chancellorsville, is when Lee begins to come north. And I'm building up to something here. So for several weeks, General Hooker is not right. And the generals know this. And on top of that, if you know any personalities of people that are always threatening to quit, they're not being appreciated. I shouldn't go on any longer. People don't understand me. And Hooker was somewhat, well, he was a major complainer. Finally, at the end of June, as the Army of the Potomac is inside of General Lee's army to protect Washington, somewhere close to the Virginia border, in the middle of the night, General Meade is awakened with a messenger from President Lincoln. Meade thought he was going to be relieved of command and sent home. Actually, the opposite. President Lincoln elevates General Meade to be the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac. And notice the date. It's June 28th. General Hooker is sent home to recuperate, which Hooker finally does come back to the Army later on. But it is now General Meade who now commands the Army of the Potomac, and that's June 28th. And you remember Gettysburg starts July 1st. So Meade is only the commander of this army for 4 days. And when Meade becomes the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac, it was an army in disarray. It was a disaster. Things are very, very difficult. Hooker has done tremendous things to harm the army. And so when he takes command of this army, it's a very dysfunctional army. And I find it ironic that a lot of the soldiers were out of control. And guess where most of those soldiers were from? I know you're all muted. Most of those soldiers that were totally out of control were from Philadelphia. You Philly boys are totally out of control. So they were probably the grandfathers of the modern day mummers. So what General Meade does is he puts a general named Alexander Webb in charge of these men to instill discipline in them. Why is that important? Because where are a lot of these Philadelphia troops during Pickett's charge? They're right up there at the angle. And who's overseeing them? General Alexander Webb, showing them discipline. So Meade then, and we also know that oftentimes President Lincoln would ask a general if they wanted to be the commanding general of the army. Meade is the first Union general that President Lincoln, he didn't request it, he didn't beg him, he didn't ask him, he commanded Meade to be the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac. So Meade takes over the Army of the Potomac, an army that's in total disarray, has major problems, and now, which we don't know it then, in 3 to 4 days, General Meade now is going to take on Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg. So at Gettysburg, when General Reynolds, which I mentioned already, was shot and killed, Meade sends up Winfield Scott Hancock. This again goes back to his ability to be very analytical as an engineer. Meade knows the ability of General Hancock. He knows the abilities of General Reynolds, General Hancock, General Sickles, General Doubleday, General Greene over on Culp's Hill, General Butterfield, and he elevates them to command these troops even before Meade comes up to the battle, and he doesn't get there till the night of the 1st. So when we think of this, General Meade is a commanding general for 4 days before he has to take on the Army of Northern Virginia and General Lee, who has not lost yet to a Union army. So this is very important. And again, we see at Gettysburg where Meade places these generals, where Hancock is on Cemetery Hill. And then the second day, he is now down in close to Little Round Top and the slaughter pen. And he puts Hancock down by the wheat field. And we see the importance of these strategic locations where Meade places his men. And again, remember, he gets word from General Warren that you better get men up on Little Round Top, and Meade immediately sends Joshua Chamberlain's 20th Maine down there, and you're familiar with that story. So 4 days, he's the commanding of the Union Army. Meade wins the Battle of Gettysburg, primarily because he has the ability to put his generals in charge and strategically put them and where to put them. And it is not by accident that Meade wins the Battle of Gettysburg, primarily because he knows where to put the generals and use them in their strength. So we see that there, and it's just fascinating to me that General Lee has not lost a battle in 2 years. He takes on a virtually unknown general in General Meade at Gettysburg, and Meade wins this battle. And actually, when Lee gets out onto the field on the afternoon of July 1st, he still doesn't know that General Hooker had been relieved of command, and General Meade now is the commanding officer of the Army of the Potomac. So we see this at Meade. We see Meade at the Wilderness, and then this is where in March of the next year, President Lincoln brings Ulysses S. Grant to the East. And it's in March, General Grant goes to Washington, D.C. And again, it's politics. There's so much politics. President Lincoln wanted to be assured by General Grant that he wasn't going to run for the presidency in 1864, because Grant now is very popular. And so when President Lincoln then gets Grant's word that he's not going to run for the presidency, he sends him out to be the commanding officer of all the Union armies. And so what happens is Grant now actively wants to annihilate General Lee. So he now is going to become actively involved, particularly with the Army of the Potomac. General Meade is still the commanding officer of the Army of the Potomac. General Meade offers his resignation to General Grant. General Grant refuses his resignation, says to General Meade, "You are the commanding officer of the Army of the Potomac." Now we know, Grant gets his hands involved in the 40-day Wilderness Campaign, and he does a lot of the planning, but General Grant refuses to accept his resignation. So again, I think that really shows us this ability that General Meade had and the respect that General Grant had for General Meade. And let me give you another quote by General Grant. He says, and this is a direct quote, that General Meade and General Sherman are the most fit generals I have ever commanded. General Meade and General Sherman are the most fit officers I have ever commanded. So we see General Meade and we see him for the rest of the war. He is at the siege of Petersburg. He is not at Appomattox. And the reason he's not at Appomattox is because the General Grant sends him into Richmond, as General Grant now with the rest of the Army of the Potomac chases Robert E. Lee out to Appomattox for Lee's surrender. So General Meade is in Richmond at Appomattox. Now, his horse, which I love, General Meade's horse, which is, his nickname was Old Baldy. Where is that? Is a picture of Old Baldy. Old Baldy is wounded at least 11 times during the war, and he survives. And Old Baldy is finally retired, and he is sent out to recuperate and to send out to a farm out in Downingtown. Old Baldy survives the war, and then when General Meade dies, Old Baldy is the horse that pulls his caisson to the Laurel Hill Cemetery. And so Old Baldy, with 11 wounds, survives the war, and Old Baldy survives till 1882. And some people don't like this, but the taxidermists, they mounted Old Baldy's head, and it was, Old Baldy was in the Civil War Museum in Philadelphia until it closed down. And the last place that I see it, Old Baldy, I believe he is now out at the museum in Gettysburg, not being displayed, but many of the artifacts that were at the Civil War Museum in Philadelphia went out to Gettysburg. So Old Baldy head is mounted, and it was in the Civil War Museum in Philadelphia. Very similar to Robert E. Lee's horse, Traveler. His skeleton is on display at VMI. Stonewall Jackson's horse is stuffed. Little Cyril, it's stuffed. It's stuffed, and so you can see. I'm sorry, not VMI. General Lee is at Lee and Washington College. Old Bald or Stonewall Jackson's horse, Little Cyril, is stuffed and at VMI. So, you know, remember these horses place tremendous significance. And Old Baldy was faithful, wounded at least 11 times, pulls General Meade's caisson to Laurel Hill Cemetery. After the war, General Meade goes on to be the commissioner of Fairmount Park until his death. Philadelphia gave General Meade's widow a home at Delancey Place, and there was a plaque underneath the home says Meade's home, and that plaque is still there. General Meade received an honorary doctorate degree from Harvard for his scientific work with the hydraulic light and for his lighthouse engineering. And it said General Meade dies and was 57 years old, and he is brought to Laurel Hill Cemetery, and his grave is very small. It's not large and drawing attention, but he is buried in Laurel Hill Cemetery with a lot of General Meade's family. Meade's legacy. There are 7 statues to General Meade. There are 2 Army forts named after General Meade. There are 2 counties in Kansas and South Dakota named after General Meade. And during World War II, we had a Liberty ship named after General George Meade. In 1891, the $1,000 Treasury note, also called the coin note, had Meade's portrait on it. And then 2 last things. The actor Michael Fox, if you remember, if you were fans of Lost, he was one of the major roles on that TV series. He is the great grandson of George Meade. And for we that are really old, the great granddaughter of General Meade was Happy Rockefeller.
Aw.
So we see the legacy of General Meade for many, many more years. So again, that's all very just hopefully touches your appetite of General Meade and General Hancock. Read about them in detail and see these phenomenal careers that they had. And I am humbled and proud to be called a Philadelphian for at least two of these men, George Meade and General Hancock. So Marianne, I will stop with that because it's just been about an hour.
Awesome. I actually have one question and one comment. Do you think Lee underestimated the Army of the Potomac, thinking Hooker was still in charge?
Well, the problem now, this is where Marianne, my wife, says to me, I wish I didn't ask you questions because we historians don't give short answers. I'll try to be very short. If you remember, Stonewall Jackson is killed at Chancellorsville.
Mm-hmm.
So Lee is really without our intelligence at Gettysburg. So Lee really doesn't realize how many men or how much supplies are coming into Gettysburg hour after hour after hour. And one of the reasons is because Lee does not understand how much Union supplies and men are coming into Gettysburg. So I don't believe he underestimated at all. But again, he has not lost the battle yet. And he believes that he can also even win here at Gettysburg, even when Meade becomes the commanding officer. So, I mean, we can see, I don't believe he underestimated, because when we look at Lee's battle plans, they were very, very good battle plans. The problem is many times they just simply weren't carried out. And again, the other part was how many men and how many supplies are coming into the Union lines every hour during those 3 days, which is another general, Bart, that we need to look at, who was also a Philadelphia guy named General Herman Halp, who was the unsung hero. So, Marianne, it's a long answer for you.
No, that's a great answer. My other comment is that the King of Prussia Historical Society, which I also work with, just they're doing a two-part program actually on the 51st Pennsylvania, which will eventually be available on YouTube. The first part was just aired live a couple of weeks ago. They were one of those Philadelphia groups that were a little bit rowdy, shall we say.
Yeah. And, Marianne, maybe you can tell us, why are these Philly people so rowdy?
They're just very enthusiastic about their cause, I imagine.
I guess, and so we come from a long line of rowdy genes, don't we?
It's not a bad thing, I don't think.
No, not one bit.
All right. Michael McTiernan, unmute your, if you unmute, you can ask your question.
I think I'm unmuted. Am I?
Yep, go ahead.
All right, sorry. Very good. Was Meade ever wounded?
Yes, he was wounded 3 times.
That's what I thought you said, but then on that horse that you had the picture of, my recollection is that if the soldier's wounded, one leg is raised in front, and if he's killed in battle, both legs are raised in front. But he had all 4 legs on the statue.
And that is a point of controversy with a lot of us historians. I hold to the view with several other historians that the legs up on a horse on the statue is more myth than actual fact.
I like the myth better.
Yeah, well, well, it makes for great TV.
Yes.
And a great. So and there's I see it both ways, but I hold with many others because of your example of the legs on a horse is pretty much whatever the sculptors wanted it to be.
Okay, thank you.
But it's something, look at it and debate and talk about. But Meade was wounded 3 times.
All right, well, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, not seeing other questions currently. This was awesome. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, even though I know the folks at the W.S. Hancock Society, and they're wonderful and big proponents of Hancock's legacy. But I learned a lot more than I knew before. And also about General Meade. I had no idea about General Meade and the lighthouses.
Well, these men are just, are just fascinating in what they were able to do and their personalities. And there's just so much there that we just, simply overlook and just have their names. I'll ask one more question in case anybody can answer it. Who was the only Philadelphian to become a Confederate general? John Pemberton. John Pemberton, he married a Virginian and she swayed him to fight for the Confederacy. And it's John Pemberton who surrenders his army to Ulysses S. Grant at Vicksburg. And my tie, Marianne, is when Pemberton, when he dies, wants to be buried at the Laurel Cemetery. And the Meade family raised holy heck not to allow Pemberton to be buried there because he was a Confederate. So they eventually worked it out, but I mean that's the tie to Meade family and Pemberton, the only Philadelphian who became a general for the Confederacy.
Awesome. Okay, any other comments or questions before we wrap it up? Okay, so on behalf of the Tredyffrin Public Library and the Tredyffrin Easttown Historical Society, thank you very, very much for attending. If you want, this should be available shortly on the library's YouTube channel. So if you just Google Tredyffrin Libraries in YouTube, you should find our channel and be able to find this program and many, many, many other programs that we've taped and put out there during COVID. We've tried to make everything available that we can. If you're looking for more programs that the library is doing, aside from historical stuff, you can go to the library's website at tredyffrinlibraries.org and click on the calendar. The next program that the library and the Historical Society are doing together is coming up. It's another online webinar. It's going to be on Sunday, November 8th at 2 p.m. So mark your calendars. And Bart Van Valkenburg is going to share his remembrances of veterans with local connections. More information and reference registration links will be sent in the TEHS newsletter, found on the TEHS website and on the Tredyffrin Public Library website. If you would like to receive the Tredyffrin Easttown Historical Society email newsletter, look for the sign up link in the lower right-hand corner of the homepage. And again, we are member supported, so please consider joining us or making a donation. And we hope to see you in November at our next program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you.